Okay, so we're getting into chapter 7 of section 1. Where'd all this stuff come from? Now, for a very long time, when there was no writing and people just passed stories from generation to generation to generation, and the question came up, where'd all this stuff come from? Well, nobody's verbal histories went back very far. And so it made perfect sense to, if you were trying to figure out where it all came from, to assume that whenever it started, it pretty much looked the same way as it did then, that the world was created kind of fully formed. And they were just living in a continuation of that, which very much requires some sort of supernatural poof beginning. And it isn't that science is necessarily anti-religion, but remember, when you're doing science, it's always like, oh, I got an idea. Well, how do you test that? Well, poof is not a testable idea. There's actually a scientific poof explanation that isn't particularly enjoyed because it doesn't really have a lot of testability either. So we're doing origins of life, and basically the whole history of life. Sperm is an old Latin word for seed. It'll show up in a number of the plant group names too. Panspermia is kind of widespread seed. And the idea in panspermia is that the first life on Earth wasn't fully formed the way it is today, but it was recognizable life, and it came from somewhere else. Carried in on meteors, the more fringe ones is brought here by intelligent aliens. But the question then becomes, so where did it come from and how did it start there? To which the answer is essentially poof. So it's not, people have isolated or supposedly isolated bacteria from the inner crevices of meteorites, but that's always a tricky thing to do, and be sure that it wasn't contaminated, because you did not exactly go up and catch them with a net. You're picking them up off the ground after they've impacted. So people started to think about, so where did life come from? And they knew that from fossils that life had not always been the way that it is now, and that as you went farther and farther back, the types of life that were in the fossil records seemed to be less and less complicated, simpler and simpler life, until the point where it was even hard to tell whether there was life beyond a certain ancient layer. Because remember, fossils are primarily hard parts, and there were fewer and fewer hard parts, and then there was almost no hard parts. And the thing is, well, were there soft part living things before this, and how far before this were there? So people, here we go with uniformitarianism. They'd look at the world around them, and they'd go, okay, well, in general terms, all life on the planet needs a bottom of the food chain, which is plants. So in order to start any kind of ecosystem, you need plants to get rolling early. You need plants basically to get rolling first. And photosynthesis as a process is a very complicated process to kind of have it kind of roll. There's no way to come up with a kind of a first step rollout for photosynthesis. It's what they call the plant problem. And it was a real roadblock to trying to figure out what they were dealing with. Primordial soup again. When we get to photosynthesis, we'll talk a little bit about how materials, different atoms, different molecules can absorb different frequencies of light. It shakes them up. they hold it for a little bit, and then they spit it out at a different frequency because they've used a little bit of the energy that came in. So light coming through space dust, you can read the frequencies of light coming out of the dust and know what's in the dust, even though it's very, very far out in space, but there's stars behind it. Light's being absorbed by the dust, different light, different frequencies being kicked back out in our direction. And people started to realize that space dust wasn't just rocky dust, that there were complicated molecules. There were organic molecules, carbon-based molecules in space dust. People had started to figure out that the Earth was, there was a spinning disk. We can actually see these out in other solar systems now, spinning disks and planets forming and such from the dust of the disk, coalescing the gravity pulling it together. But it wouldn't have been just rocks and water and some gases. It would have been organic materials as well, which are fairly light. What you get when a planet forms is when it's all coalesced gravitationally, it's molten. The heavy stuff tends to sink to the middle. That's why there's an iron core on the Earth, and a lot of heavy materials are farther down. And the lighter stuff winds up on the outside. You get the atmosphere, you get the water, but also organic materials are pretty light also. And they would have wound up on the surface mixed into the water once you had it cool enough for there to be liquid water on the surface. It would have been full of organic material. And they called that primordial soup. But little organic molecules. We're built of big organic molecules. Can you get one from the other? Can you get the big ones from the little ones? Well, back in the 1950s, a couple of guys in Chicago built a big vat of what they considered primordial soup to be, came up with potential energy sources that could have influenced the primordial soup. In this case, they made mini lightning occur between two electrodes right over the surface of the water. They set it cooking for a couple of months. And when they analyzed what was in there, there were bigger molecules than what they had put in. So there were molecules absorbing energy from around them and using it to form bigger molecules. So the idea of starting with little molecules and then getting big molecules, kind of like us, like not like us, but like what we have, it was kind of a proof of concept. It also would have been much warmer, right? The Earth was cool enough to have liquid oceans, but it's still pretty toasty. And chemistry happens faster when it's warm. People go, well, what are the odds of forming, complex molecules like we have? And you go, well, the odds are really lousy. But then you think about an entire planet covered with this stuff for millions of years, cooking away, and the odds start to get a little bit better. We're talking about asexual reproduction and how mutations are mostly neutral or bad, but you get an occasional good one. It doesn't happen very often, but it works if you're going to crank out trillions of offspring. You get the same thing here. The first steps toward living things wouldn't have looked like living things. They wouldn't have been, the sort of things that even bacteria, they wouldn't have even been that simple. They would have been clusters of molecules, probably working together, because, better to team up than to be alone. They'd only needed a few features in order to kind of get rolling toward what you eventually need. They needed to be able to pull energy from the environment and put themselves together. They needed to be self-organizing, which is kind of what that vat showed could happen. They need to be able to make more of themselves. It could be a matter of getting bigger and bigger and just splitting, dividing off and then growing bigger molecules from the pieces and dividing and growing bigger molecules from the pieces. As long as you get copies, that works. And because we're talking about early steps that eventually led to us, they got to be able to change over time. They got to be able to get more complicated. They got to be able to get more organized. They got to be able to pull in some of the stuff that's the next thing on this list. When we talked about genetics, proteins, enzymes pretty much run all of our chemistry, and a whole bunch of our functional molecules are proteins. But we don't store that information for those proteins in proteins, we store it in DNA coding. And so that's eventually, by the time you get to cellular life, that's kind of what you already needed. You needed eventually to get to a protein-based chemistry system with DNA coding. And that's a big question. Nobody's really come super close to figuring out how that happened. The leading candidate right now is RNA, a molecule that has some of the coding abilities of DNA and some of the functional capabilities of proteins, as kind of, they call it the RNA world, that this first systems were RNA based. Some of them wound up coding for proteins that worked a little bit better than the RNA did, and eventually the codes became just codes for proteins, and the proteins started to take over the work. DNA is a more stable coding system, as it doesn't take much of a change of RNA to get DNA, but nobody's really been able to work it out in a lab just exactly how you get there. There's a lot of missing pieces to these, but it does come down to what can you test. Primordial soup, it's still under the crust. It bubbles up out of cracks at hydrothermal vents. The outer planets are covered with primordial soup. Is that one of the moons of Saturn has methane lakes and rivers and methane rain. Methane is a simple organic material. So primordial soup's very much been confirmed by a whole bunch of tests and evidence since they came up with the idea. And some of this proof of concept stuff, like the vat, people have done various kinds of tests. But getting from this to this is tricky. So you need protein chemistry and DNA coding, and you need cells, right? Chambers that kind of isolate the chemistry from the surroundings or from other chambers. That's not that tricky to come up with, because embedded in the primordial soup are materials that are similar to the materials of cell membranes. It would have settled on the surface of the ocean because it's light and it doesn't mix well, but it was a turbulent, stormy planet. So it constantly would have been stirred up and bubbles would have been formed underneath. And any bubbles that these molecules could kind of hold together and stabilize that could help them isolate themselves from their surroundings would have been useful. They called those original ones protocells. And you can kind of whip those up in the lab. Not exactly, you don't know what the exact first ones were, but you can get them to work in the lab. So testing does kind of work for this stuff. So the Earth forms 4.5 billion years ago, cools enough to get a hard crust. Eventually you get oceans. This is an old overhead, the oldest prokaryotic fossils, in which case they leave traces in the sediments that indicate that there are living bacterial cells. And that goes back to just a couple 100 million years after the oceans had formed, after the primordial soup formed. So you get bacteria. And then a bunch of time goes by before you get cells like our cells. I'll write this down and talk about it in a minute. Quite a bit of time goes by. This is 1.5 billion years. This is 4.5 billion years. So a lot of time goes by before you get multicellular organisms, animal fossils, land organisms, only a little less than 500 million years ago. And then, we're way up, we're like this line up on the top. A lot of stuff's going on in the Earth before we came along. But the next step in the step processes. Bacterial type cells, little cells, DNA coding, but no nucleus, protein chemistry, fairly complicated, but not necessarily as complicated as ours. No separate internal chambers, but they're still more successful than the eukaryotes. There's still way more of those, not just more of them, but they add up to more weight than all the eukaryotes. So it started as a prokaryotic world. It still pretty much is a prokaryotic world. And these guys, these bacteria, worked out pretty much all the major abilities that we look at for what living things can do. What are they living on? Well, they're consuming what's in the primordial soup, but that's got, the soup runs out after a while. They're probably scarfing up each other. Bacteria do that. There's probably viruses at work as well. Virus is probably an offshoot of those first molecular systems. So they may not really be alive the way that other things are alive. But the prokaryotes, as it said on the thing I had up, around billions and billions of years. Oops. In areas where primordial soup was still available, cracks in the bottom of the planet where this organic primordial soup stuff was still mixing with the water. And it was hot because it was mixing with magma underneath the surface. System developed using the heat to slam small organic materials in together and make glucose, make a great fuel molecule. That's called chemosynthesis. And the reason that the plant problem persisted for a while is nobody knew this existed until they discovered it happening a mile deep in the oceans, on these cracks that still exist where the ocean is forming new ocean, the continents are moving away from one another. And there's whole ecosystems down there where the bottom of that food chain isn't using light as a source of energy to make fuel molecules, it's using heat, a much simpler approach to doing it. And that was chemosynthesis. So that was the first bottom of the food chain production system. They call these ant plants producers. They produce the fuel that everybody else needs. Now we do know that eventually we get photosynthesis. And the question becomes, why? Still a big leap from chemosynthesis to photosynthesis. Is that if evolution happens by building on mutational changes and getting new abilities in proteins, then the leap from chemosynthesis to photosynthesis was hard one to puzzle out. And it wasn't until, now once they knew that there were ecosystems down at the bottom of the ocean, they'd bring up a whole bunch of specimens. These were brand new, they lived in a very unique environment, so they were unrelated to other things up on the surface. Well, they were related, but they were different species. And so biologists would send these submarines down and they would collect specimens and then they would bring them up and they would go through them and they would identify them and name them and connect them to things. And so at some point, and typically, I'm kind of embellishing this story, but the story basically works. These two guys are sorting through like the arthropods, the crabs and stuff that they get off of these things, which are very white, because no light reaches these cracks. And he's looking at these things. He says to the guy next to him, they got eyes. And the fellow goes, yeah. He goes, you've been down there, right? In the submarine? Yeah. You need the lights, right? Yeah. Really dark, right? why do they have eyes? Is that there are things down there that glow, they use eyes to find each other and do other kinds of things, but these guys don't glow, and does something glow down there that they would need eyes for? And they went, well, I guess we'll have to check. So they took their submarine down one of the next things and settled it on the bottom and turned all the lights off. I can't imagine sitting under a mile of ocean with no lights on, waiting to see if you could, once your eyes adjusted, whether there was anything to see. And it turns out chemistry in these hydrothermal vents produces a glow. And the vents are very turbulent, a lot of hot water. If you get into the wrong place, you get swept away. You got to find your way back because that's where the food is. That's why they have eyes. But that means that they have a chemistry that allows them to process light for that sense. You take chemosynthesis, combine it mutationally with a light sensing system that's already in place, it's a little bit easy to get to a light using system for synthesis, photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide and water using light as an energy source produces glucose and releases oxygen. Oxygen is a byproduct. Now, oxygen is very reactive. Would have been, as photosynthesis, any of these organisms doing this, it turns out there are still photosynthetic organisms using the light from these vents to make glucose. They actually have found simple photosynthesis. Nobody really expected to, but once they started looking, they found there's a holdover from the very original photosynthetic organisms working off of these glowing vents a mile down. But think of the original photosynthetic organisms caught in the turbulence and taken up to the surface. It's like, a buffet up there. There's all sorts of light. So it didn't take too much for the photosynthetic organisms to get off of their original starting places and wind up all over the surface of this planet, all over the oceans. Cranking out oxygen, cranking out fuel, cranking out oxygen. Oxygen being very reactive in chemical systems that are not ready to deal with it can be very poisonous. I could poison you if I put you in a hyperbaric chamber and crank the oxygen up, because even we can't handle too much of it. And it reacted with other things in the ocean. There's a link in the book, you can see this. We know when this started because for millions and millions of years, what built up in the sediments was rust. Iron oxide. Regular iron dissolves in water pretty well. Would have been in the oceans pretty much everywhere. Iron oxide, iron and oxygen, doesn't dissolve very well, settled into the oceans, became integrated into the sediments for millions and millions and millions of years as more and more oxygen built up in the oceans and percolated out into the atmosphere, eventually helping to form an ozone layer to block some of the nastier parts of sunlight from reaching the surface. But, so we know kind of indirectly when this happened. While I'm on the subject, these weird lumpy things. Geologist in Minnesota is looking at these sedimentary rocks from this ancient layer of stuff, finding these lumpy things. Just lumps of rocks in what would have been the surf zone of these ancient oceans. Very volcanic, lots of stuff, and he's going, but I can't figure out how the heck these things form in the, how do they precipitate into the water and form these blobs? Made no sense to him. And then he went on vacation to Australia. He was going to go do some snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef. And to get out to where he was going to snorkel, he's stepping over these things in the surf. Okay, these things didn't just exist 4 billion years ago. They exist now. What the heck are they? He checked around and found out these are clumps of bacteria that pull minerals out of the water, deposit them in these lumps to kind of protect themselves from the actions of the surf. And so these are evidence of very, very, very early life. Remember early life doesn't have hard parts. This is as close as you get to bacterial life having hard parts. And now these stromatolites, people knew, were representatives of some of the very first life that you can actually see clearly in the fossil record. One of the reasons I like to mention this is that between here and Saratoga, just off Route 29, there's what they call the Petrified Gardens. And if you go and look, they don't look like much. But there are remnants of these in those fossil beds. And what makes them very cool is these are basically the earliest very clear fossils of living things from an ancient billions of years old time of the Earth. So, the fact that it's local makes it fairly cool. Okay, we will stop there and pick this up with eukaryotes.